You can start.
Hello, Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to the Center for Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul Civilizing University. This is our 50th webinar, a monthly webinar where we invite experts in the field of Islam and Islamic studies and international relations to come speak and share their work with us, the community in IZU, consisting of graduate students and faculty members, along with our larger community off campus. I want to welcome today a very special and honored guest, Dr. Arya Nakisa. He is a professor of Islamic Studies and Anthropology at the Washington University in St. Louis. His research deals with modern and pre-modern periods, focused on Islamic law, Islamic legal history, Sufism, and also colonialism. Today, we've invited him to speak on the state of emergency and colonial governance in the Muslim world. He's published widely in many different journals, and he also has a book out, as I know, right, Dr. Arya, on Islam and on legal education in Egypt. I want to hand it over to Dr. Arya. He's going to speak for 20 minutes on the topic at hand, and then we will follow it up with a discussion. So I don't want to waste anybody's time. Dr. Arya Nakisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. I study, so today I'm going to talk to you about the topic that is a state of emergency and how it relates to colonial governance in the Muslim world. It's a topic that I am putting out some material on right now. It's a little bit, this is the first time I've given a talk on this subject, but when I give talks, I like to address different subjects. This is a great opportunity to deal with this subject. So one major trend in recent scholarship on the Muslim world is to highlight parallels between political life in the present day and political life in the colonial era. Many recent studies of this type pay special attention to the intertwined phenomena of terrorism and counterterrorism. And these phenomena have deeply shaped life in Muslim countries in the past 2 decades since the 9/11 attacks. Now, when people think of terrorism and counterterrorism, they usually do not think of the colonial era. However, recent scholarship has argued that, in fact, phenomena of this type were an important element of political life in the colonial era. More specifically, colonial governments ruling over Muslim populations were intensely concerned with phenomena akin to terrorism and radicalism. Accordingly, these governments invested enormous resources in security policies that resemble modern-day counterterrorism. And they justified their policies with respect to a particular liberal political doctrine known as the state of emergency. So my short presentation today deals with these issues. It's about how liberal states like France and Britain and the Netherlands colonized Muslim lands and then ruled over them for an extended period using measures that resemble contemporary counterterrorism measures, justifying them with reference to a state of emergency. So let me begin by saying a couple introductory remarks about liberal governance and how it relates to colonial rule in the Muslim world. So from its inception, liberalism has promoted civilizational progress as a central ideal. This ideal assumes that societies progress materially and morally over time. In this scheme, material progress is equated with continuous increases in scientific knowledge, technology, and economic output. Meanwhile, moral progress is equated with the continuous reform of laws and norms, such that they afford people increasing freedom and increasing equality. It is assumed that Western societies have achieved the highest level of civilizational progress. Today, the general notion of civilizational progress is articulated in terms of development, while the more specific notion of moral progress is usually articulated today in terms of human rights. So since the late 18th century, many liberals have endorsed the view that Western societies have a moral obligation to spread civilizational progress throughout the world. And this obligation is often referred to as the civilizing mission or the white man's burden. And more specifically, according to this set of ideas, Westerners have a moral obligation to establish political control, indeed authoritarian political control over non-Western lands. And they must use this control to efficiently transplant new technologies and economic institutions, and also to compel non-Westerners to adopt civilizational progress, or what we would today call development and human rights. It is, of course, it has always been since the late 18th century recognized that many Westerners will resist this. They will resist this notion of civilizational progress. They will resist this process because it threatens to radically alter or destroy their ways of life, kind of their religious and cultural traditions. At any rate, between the late 18th and mid 20th centuries, Western states established vast empires, justifying their actions as a means of spreading civilizational progress. The empires which were established encompassed almost all regions with Muslim populations. So the British Empire encompassed the Indian subcontinent, along with many parts of the Middle East and sub-Saharan Africa. The French Empire encompassed North and West Africa and parts of the Middle East. The Dutch Empire encompassed what is today known as Indonesia. One of the things that the empires did when they took over these lands, so some of these lands were majority Muslim, some were majority non-Muslim, others were mixed. But whenever the empires established, whenever the European states established these empires, one of the things they always did was to conduct scholarly research on Western people with the aim of crafting effective policy for governing them. And they thought that these policies that they're going to craft are going to take into account each people's distinctive religious, cultural, and racial traits. Imperial scholarship on Muslims gave extensive attention to particular topics. So these included the topics of Orthodox Islam, Sharia, and jihad. So Orthodox Islam may be defined as the basic teachings of pre-modern Sunni Islam. Generally speaking, Orthodox Islam places a great emphasis on scriptural texts like the Quran and Hadith and interprets these texts in a relatively literalistic manner. Orthodox Islam also prescribes an expansive corpus of norms known as the Sharia, which regulate worship, diet, dress, family life, commercial transaction, criminal punishment, and the like. Although the Sharia values individual freedom and equality to some extent, it limits them for the sake of strengthening and preserving certain relationships and forms of community. Thus, to strengthen and maintain marital and family relationships, the Sharia prescribes duties for husbands and wives, duties for parents and children, and general duties towards kin. To strengthen and maintain the human relationship with God, the Sharia prescribes duties of worship or ibadah. To strengthen and maintain a common Muslim identity and form of community or ummah, the Sharia prescribes shared rituals, dietary norms, and forms of dress. All of the duties mentioned above limit individual freedom, and many of them sanction different or unequal roles. So for instance, husband versus wife, parents versus children. This is problematic from the standpoint of liberalism and liberal empires. So liberalism stresses individualism. It places less value on maintaining relationships or community. Consequently, from a liberal standpoint, Sharia limitations on freedom and equality are excessive, immoral, and violate what we would today call human rights. Additionally, Orthodox Islam prescribes a type of religious warfare known as jihad. One fundamental aim of jihad is to defend the Muslim community. Hence, where they are able, Muslims are encouraged to wage jihad to protect the lives and property of Muslims, to repel non-Muslim invasions, and to expel non-Muslim empires from Muslim lands. But committed to secularism, liberalism holds that politics and warfare should not be guided by religious considerations, and hence views any type of jihad as problematic. So based on their research, the empires came to view Orthodox Islam and its Sharia and jihad doctrines as obstacles to their aim, and they kind of obsessively discussed these issues. Today, the scholarship of the European empires on these topics is often referred to as Orientalism. Orientalist scholarship is the type of scholarship that was generated to examine these issues with an eye towards crafting policy for governing Muslim societies. So the European empires recognized that overall, whenever they invaded any Western land, the Hindu, Confucian, Buddhist, Muslim, that non-Westerners would resist the process or the project of progress to some extent for the sake of protecting their cherished lifeways, their cherished cultures and religious traditions. However, the imperial policy makers argued during the 19th century that Muslim resistance would be especially intense. This is because the Muslim lifeway is embodied in an expansive and rigid set of Sharia norms, which are believed to be mandated by God. So it said, all peoples are going to resist the European imperial project to dissolve their ways of life, but Muslims are going to resist more because they believe that their entire way of life is mandated by God. Imperial policymakers also recognized all non-Western peoples were likely to seek to free themselves from imperial Western rule through violent revolt. However, policymakers argued that Muslims were especially likely to engage in revolt because it is encouraged by their religion. It's encouraged by a jihad doctrine. So imperial discourse, imperial scholarship on Muslims and the challenge posed by ruling Muslims not only constantly made reference to Sharia and jihad and Orthodox Islam, but it constantly made reference to a concept of fanaticism, which is very similar to what we might today call radicalism. So in contemporary discourses on Muslim societies, there's often reference to this notion of radicalism, but the same is true during the 19th century, except during the 19th century, they continuously made reference to the fanaticism, that Islamic doctrine by its very nature gives rise to fanaticism. Now, in the 19th century under colonial rule, fanaticism connoted zealous attachment to Orthodox Islam. Although colonial officials had significant disagreement over whether Orthodox Islam could be separated from a doctrine such as jihad. So some officials said, no separation between Orthodox Islam and jihad is possible. And for that reason, simple everyday practice or teaching of Orthodox Islam, even if it's just teaching the 5 daily prayers, even if it's just reading the Quran, it contributes to the spread of Orthodox Islam and hence encourages jihad and should be repressed. However, you also had colonial officials who said, no, the general phenomenon of Islam is not necessarily a security threat. It can be separated from the doctrine of jihad. But even then, even those colonial officials who believed that Orthodox Islam could be separated from the doctrine of jihad still considered the doctrine of Orthodox Islam or fanatic attachment to Orthodox Islam to be problematic. Why? Because many of the norms of Orthodox Islam were still seen as an obstacle to progress, an obstacle to development and human rights. So, as indicated above, the European empires utilized authoritarian rule to control indigenous populations and compel them to accept progress. Authoritarian rule, whether dealing with Muslim populations or non-Muslim populations, was typically justified with reference to a liberal legal doctrine known as the state of exception or the state of emergency. This doctrine holds that the government is not bound by ordinary liberal laws when an extraordinary threat exists. So, For instance, if there's an extraordinary threat like a pandemic, for instance, ordinary laws no longer apply. So maybe ordinarily you can't search everyone, you can't force people to stay in their houses, you can't control what people say online, but maybe if there's a big threat like a pandemic, you can. Or if there's a military invasion, or if there's a natural disaster. So whenever there's a big threat, the ordinary laws can be set aside in order to allow the government to address the threat. Now, for the European empires, indigenous populations posed an extraordinary threat. Because they sometimes revolted, they would go ahead and attack not only Muslims, but non-Muslims. So for instance, Amerindian populations, Hindu Indians, there was always the danger that they were going to revolt against colonial officials and against European settlers. And in fact, the type of indigenous revolts that existed during the colonial period, so throughout the 19th century and early into the 20th century, made use of tactics like bombings, assassinations, and robberies. And by the early 20th century, Europeans commonly used the term terrorism to describe these colonial revolts. So responding to the threat of these colonial revolts and the threat of this type of behavior, the European empires instituted special security measures, which were implemented by military institutions. So soldiers, intelligence units, and military courts. And what the colonial governments did, whether they were governing Muslim or non-Muslim populations, they engaged in what were known at the time as counterinsurgency operations, but which resemble what are today known as counterterrorism operations. So colonial security measures at this time, which were used to address the threat of an indigenous revolt, were fundamentally discriminatory. Rather than targeting individuals, they targeted entire groups based on their racial, cultural, and religious traits. So, for instance, measures were applied to the indigenous population, but they excluded Europeans, for instance, living in Muslim lands, whether we're talking about the Middle East or North Africa or Indonesia. So, for instance, if you were an administrator or a European settler, you weren't bound by these regulations, but the indigenous population was. So Muslims were subjected to the same security measures as other indigenous groups. However, in the case of Muslims, such measures entailed uniquely intense forms of religious discrimination, which were informed by colonial concerns over fanaticism and jihad rebellion. In a colonial context, indigenous peoples were not only denied the right to vote, security measures also denied them freedom of expression. So laws prohibited indigenous people from insulting the imperial government or criticizing its policies. Imperial officials also shut down newspapers. So for instance, whenever there were Muslim newspapers that criticized European policies or European rule over Muslim lands, these were shut down and the publishers were prosecuted and the newspapers were banned. So you can think of Al-Urwa al-Wuthqa of Afghani and Abdu, or Al-Mantaqid of Ibn Badis, or Utusan Hindiya of Syarikat Islam in Indonesia. These were all shut down because of, or restricted due to measures, what were called counterinsurgency measures, to also prevent, to counter fanaticism. It was believed that if you start spreading these publications, it could lead to the population revolting. Security measures during the colonial period also denied freedom of association. So people weren't allowed to meet. They had to get a permit in order to meet in groups. So Muslim religious organizations, religious events, and political meetings were shut down when officials deemed them undesirable. In certain cases, political and religious protests were allowed, like the Indian Caliphate movement. However, whenever there was a fear that the protests would lead to criticism of the colonial government that was too intense, they were shut down. So as an example of that, you can think of the Moroccan Berber Daher protests. Security measures that were standard in the colonial era as part of this counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, policy also denied rights of privacy to indigenous persons. Hence, officials regularly searched their bodies and homes on a massive scale. These were known as cordon and search operations. Officials also required that all indigenous persons supply information about their personal lives upon request. Officials also instituted extensive surveillance systems. So in the case of Muslims, the empires established official departments and networks of informants to surveil religious scholars, madrasas, mosques, and Sufi orders. So there were special, so for instance, the French called these the Bureau Arabes. In the Netherlands, East Indies, so Dutch Indonesia, there was what the Kantor voor Inlandisch Zaken, and so forth. Forgive my pronunciation, I haven't been working. I have more of a reading understanding of these languages. I don't speak them. Officials also controlled and tracked Muslims' movements inside and between regions. So Muslims were frequently banned from traveling outside of their local districts without a permit. And problematic Muslims were banned or deported from specific regions. So for instance, Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi was deported from Algeria. Imam Bonjol was deported from Indonesia. Amadou Bamba was deported from West Africa. Special attention was given to tracking and controlling Muslims who were making the Hajj pilgrimage. Security measures also authorized officials to detain indigenous persons for lengthy periods of time without a trial based on general suspicions or secret intelligence. When these persons were tried, they were denied ordinary protection. So they weren't given jury trials, they weren't given access to lawyers, they weren't given rights to appeal. There was a flexible use of the death penalty. Laws also empowered officials to use violence in order to discipline and coerce punishment, and also they were allowed to administer a physical discipline in order to coerce and control their indigenous prisoners. And moreover, there were limitations on, so the colonial officials also put limitations on the ability to prosecute officials that went beyond established rules with respect to arresting and treating prisoners. So for instance, whenever there were times of unrest in places like Algeria and Indonesia, the imperial officials made significant use of tactics that were formally illegal, like torture, beatings, electrocutions, and rapes, and also extrajudicial killings and disappearances. The reason why officials could do that is because there were laws on the books blocking their discipline. So for instance, not only were officials given the right to administer corporal discipline, but for instance, when people were killed during a security operation, there wasn't an investigation into what happened. People just said, okay, well, they died, these people died, and there was no official investigation. So these arrangements were meant to protect people who were administering this type of violence. Inside and outside of the colony, security measures were applied most severely to Muslims who were viewed as fanatics, or what they call radicals. Targeting fanatics was seen to enhance security. It also had a more general social function. Thus, it stigmatized and repressed Orthodox Islamic forms of speech and practice, thereby encouraging Muslim populations to embrace a reformed Islam more consistent with liberal values of human rights and development. And when one sees that this is the nature of politics during the colonial era, one might ask, to what extent do parallels exist today? So scholarship on these matters have said, okay, there are similarities between some of these aspects of colonial governance and the type of governance that we find promoted by Western governments when it comes to Muslim populations, whether minorities in their own countries or encouraging certain types of policies in Muslim majority countries as part of the global war on terror, as part of what are called countering violent extremism or preventing violent extremism programs. Okay, so that is my presentation and I will end there.
Wow, thank you so much. So much to think about. And I think that this relationship between the colonial experience and the current experience is a is a historical thread that often goes unnoticed. So as Muslim populations, we sometimes think all of this started after 9/11, and this is the kind of what we call narrative in which all of this is explained often. But the truth of the matter is that as you have teased out, that a lot of these practices that Muslim populations, both in the West and the non-West, experience are continuations of strategies that have been tried and tested by very resourceful and historically informed colonial operators, right? So, I mean, the French lived amongst Muslims for many years. The British lived amongst Muslims for many years. These are people that cannot feign ignorance about the populations in which they're dealing, and also the strategies that they are reemploying. So, I mean, thank you so much, Dr. Nakisa, for this reminder.
Well, it's my pleasure. And kind of one point that I also wanted to emphasize is these are liberal policies. So sometimes when we see authoritarianism in the Muslim world, we see people shutting down newspapers. We see people disappearing individuals in prisons. We see people instituting massive surveillance of the population. We might say we see, control of, or these various types of control, these various methods for controlling the population. Sometimes we say, oh, that's because they haven't adopted liberal governance yet. Or maybe all of this is because these people are by their very nature inclined towards authoritarianism. Maybe these authoritarian tendencies even emerge from Muslim culture or the Muslim tradition, whereas in reality, these are aspects of liberal governance. To have a non-ending state of emergency under military rule is liberal governance. That's standard liberal governance of the Muslim world over the past 200 years.
Yeah, I mean, this is so I want to walk with you on two sets of literatures that we have now, right? In the scholarly literature. So we have one set of especially in the wake of American what was called after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Unipolar Moment, right? So in this period, we had a resurgence of liberal scholarship that revisited the relationship between liberalism and empire, right? I'm thinking about the work of Jennifer Pitts and Uday Mehta, and there was a recent book by Duncan, can't remember his name now, but the guy at Cambridge or Oxford, he had a extensive work on liberalism and empire. So what this literature tried to do was show us how liberalism is not unfamiliar with imperial policies, right? And I think this is what you're trying to point out by especially pointing out the doctrine of the state of emergency. But even when we visit theorists, right? I mean, the idea of fanaticism comes straight out of Kant, right? So Kant has a very explicit description of how a certain kind of religiosity or passionate belief, unsuppressed by reason, leads to violence and a whole set of irrational actions. And then John Stuart Mill had a very extensive in his essay on liberty, there's the famous parentalism, right? That except for savage races, everybody else deserves freedom section. Interestingly, Locke also was someone who wrote in his charter for North Carolina, he wrote justifying slavery and especially targeting what he called the Negro race. So, I mean, these are things that are embedded in liberalism from the very beginning. So, yeah, I mean, maybe there's that literature, but then there's also the literature, and I think your other part of your work speaking about Muslims kind of deals with this. We've had now a number of religious studies scholars, right, who've kind of turned towards studying Islam and colonialism. I mean, religion and colonialism and empire. So like Chittister's work, Lopez's work, Assad, Matsusawa. So there's this literature over here. So where would you position your analysis? I mean, how do you kind of place yourself? I mean, how do you respond to these people? I mean, what is your
Well, so these are both of the strains of literature that you've picked up. I mean, you've correctly indicated that they are very much related to my own scholarship. I've benefited from both of these literature. So, for instance, initially when I started reading, the Pitt stuff or the Anthony Angie stuff or the Uday Mehta stuff, I was surprised because I had thought that liberalism is fundamentally against particular forms of rule which are authoritarian in character. And then I began to see that things were more complex. So that was important in terms of turning my attention to these other issues. Now, as for these scholars who are examining the relationship between colonialism and religion, I've also really benefited a lot from them as well. I mean, especially Talal Asad. Although one of the things, so Asad has a very, very influential argument about how liberalism only tolerates specific types of religion. So religion has to be something which is private in the heart. It can't be expressed outwardly. So I find that argument very compelling. On the other hand, what I've tried to do, one of the things that I have tried to do, though, is in my own work on colonialism, I've tried to synthesize a lot of the existing scholarship on colonialism. So whenever you talk about Pitts and Uday Mehta and whatnot, they're talking about colonialism in general, but not so much colonialism in the Muslim world. And I think colonialism in the Muslim world has specific characteristics because when the European powers talked about different populations, they saw them as having different characteristics. So they saw some populations as being more, so they had this understanding that certain populations were going to more or less pass out of existence and their lifeways would pass out of existence. So that's like Amerindian populations, Aboriginal populations. Muslim populations don't fall into that category. Muslim populations are among the populations that you find in North Africa and Eurasia. And then when you're dealing with those populations, they raise different issues. So many Europeans didn't think of, for instance, East Asian populations as particularly fanatic. And they also thought that at least some East Asian populations would modernize fairly quickly. And that was partially due to their experience with Japan, in the late 19th century, that Japan ended up modernizing quickly. And they also expected that China had a lot of potential to modernize quickly. So they started also dividing up Eurasia into these different regions. So not only do you have certain populations that are going to kind of pass out of existence and just be absorbed, like Amerindians or Aboriginal populations, then you have certain populations that are probably going to be able to modernize at a rapid rate. Those are like the Northeast Asians. And then you have other populations within Asia, and they marked out Muslims as being, so they said, all of these populations or many of these populations in Eurasia are marked by their religiosity, but there are specific reasons why, but Muslims pose a specific problem. So
this is what you call Muslim exceptionalism. You're saying that there's a Muslim exceptionalism.
Yeah, so the idea is that due to the structure of their religion, Muslims are going to be more resistant to modernity. So number one, you compare Muslim to, let's say, Hindus. Hindus don't have the same, so Hinduism doesn't necessarily have the same tradition of asserting maybe its own political rule and political independence, or at least this was seen the British saw things in this way. They were like, the Hindus have been ruled over by other people. More specifically, they've been ruled over by Muslim moguls. So they're going to be less likely to demand their independence than, let's say, Muslim populations. Also, if you look at a religion like Hinduism, Hinduism is largely a set of customs that evolve over time. So, for instance, when you talk about the rapidity with which Hindus reform their religion, beginning in the 19th century with Ram Mohan Roy and Dayananda Saraswati, kind of these figures, they begin the reform process earlier, and they start undertaking very radical reforms. So you have people saying, okay, let's get rid of the caste system, let's get rid of polygamy, let's get rid of sati, kind of things proceed in a very fast direction. The British rulers saying Muslims are more resistant. Also, you compare Muslims to groups like Buddhists. Buddhists don't really have an expansive law that kind of regulates their life. So yeah, they have a monastic code, a Vinaya code, but they don't have an expansive law. And for that reason, they don't necessarily have due to that law, there's going to be less of an obstacle to accepting a certain elements of kind of Western legal transplants. So I think one way that I would differ from Mehta and Pitts and whatnot is to pay a little attention to, that people who have been colonized don't all have the same experience. They have significantly different experience. And just as today, Muslims face unique challenges, the same is true during the colonial period. So they're a unique colonized population. Now, with respect to how I would differ from, Assad and Masuzawa and some of these other people who are exploring the relationships between religion and colonialism, one of the things that I have argued in some of my past articles or in articles that are in press is that when it comes to managing the Muslim world, the issue of reforming religion is really tied to a broader policy that the colonial governments formulated for governing Muslims. And in fact, they called it Muslim policy. So the French called it like politique musulmane, or the Dutch called it Islam politique. Like we have a specific policy for ruling over Muslims. And I say that, the religious reform is one component. And someone like Assad will say this is about privatizing religion, which is true. I mean, I think that's
wouldn't he put it into like a broader framework of Protestantization, like a kind of...
Yeah, so he would say Protestant Christianity has a particular ideal of what proper religion is, which is kind of hidden, a belief which is hidden in your heart. It's not about rituals. It's certainly not about an expansive social law. And in that way, it differs not only from, let's say, Catholic religiosity, but also, let's say, Jewish or Hindu religiosity, which have kind of a more expansive legal component tied to them. So I agree that that's one component of the religious reform of Islam. But one of the things that I would add to the Assadian perspective, I would say, I tend to look at more specific programs. So for me, the reform of Islam consists of taking over the Muslim educational system, and by creating hybrid institutions like Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College, or taking over Al-Azhar and including kind of a Western educational component along with the traditional Islamic educational component. It consists in taking over the Muslim court system. So for instance, reforming Islamic law by reforming the law applied by the Sharia courts, gradually reducing it to like family law, for instance. And there's also an additional component to religious reform, which is kind of using security measures to marginalize critics of colonialism while giving high positions to people who are willing to cooperate with colonial rulers to achieve a type of religious reform. So that would be like a Syed Ahmed Khan or Muhammad Abdu. These are people who are willing to cooperate with colonial rulers and hence are given influential positions. So I would say that in terms of the Muslim policy for ruling over Muslim populations, so there's this Islamic reform component, which consists of patronizing cooperative reformers, taking over the educational system, taking over the legal system. Then there's also like a human rights component, which means basically enacting Western laws, which are seen as necessary to protect human rights. So in particular, rights of religious liberty, women's rights, children's rights, and so forth. And also working not only to change the formal laws on the books, but seeking to change the social norms so that you no longer have people stigmatized for expressing certain forms of individual freedom. So if you as an individual want to blaspheme and don't want to fast Ramadan, it's not only that there's not a law that prevents that, it's also society kind of accepts that behavior. And then in addition to this human rights component, I also think that there's a very pronounced counterterrorism component, a security component from the pre-modern era. And I see that security component is very much related to the question of religious reform. So one of the reasons why people adopt a reformed Islam which is more private, a reformed Islam which is more which incorporates certain human rights values, expanded individual liberty, expanded equality, is precisely because you don't want to be disappeared. You don't want to be tortured. You don't want to be subjected to surveillance. So I would say that counterterrorism component is also something that I would like to bring into the conversation. But if you were to read, let's say, at least in terms of what I remember, some of these other figures who are working on the relationship between colonialism and religiosity aren't necessarily going through all these very specific regulations. So Assad will talk about, or Masuzawa will talk about certain colonial measures and how they're related to the reform of Islam. But to me, I'm very interested in concrete regulations. So what regulations are used to, for instance, ban the circulation of Muslim papers? Which offices are established to infiltrate all of the mosques and Sufi orders? Which measures are taken to, for instance, bar Muslims from circulating? So, for instance, to prevent them from traveling outside of their villages. What measures are taken to ensure that they need licenses before they can have an association or meet to celebrate a religious event? So these aren't the type of issues that a Talal Assad or a Masuzawa is looking at when they're thinking of religious reform, or at least they're not looking at these specifics, whereas I'm very much interested in specifics of this type, at least in the type of research that I'm doing.
Wow. Yeah. So I have a couple of questions that come to my mind, and there's people who are writing as we're speaking. I'm getting questions from participants. This is also, as you know, live on our YouTube channel. First question I want to ask you, because you study this area of colonialism and Islam. What I've noticed is there is a particular analysis of Orientalist scholarship, right? Whereby the focus is mostly on depictions of natives and their culture as being exotic and non-humanist, I should say. And I always found it very strange. I mean, this scholarship comes out of Edward Said's work, and I always found it very strange that Said never dealt with what seemed to me to be the primary target of Orientalist scholarship, which was Orthodox Islam, right? Like, so like Orientalists were obsessed, about trying to nail down what is this thing called Orthodox Islam, and trying to present either alternatives or movements that go against it. And because it makes total sense to me, because Orthodox Islam, or what we know as being basically Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, right, was the high ideology of the pre-modern Muslim empires. And it seems completely in line with any kind of occupying power that they would try to de-seat the ruling ideology. But this never shows up in the work of like Said or any of Said's followers, that this would be the ideological part of Orientalism. In fact, that project is still ongoing today. I mean, if you look at the crux of the study of Islamic studies and the obsessions around Sunnism and those kinds of things, it seems as though like this thread is still continuing. So I'd like to know how did colonizers see Orthodox Islam? Like, what was their aims in studying it? What were their strategies in dealing with it? What were the threats of Orthodox Islam? I keep using this word. I mean, I don't know if it's the proper word to use it all, but how did they see this in terms of the relationship between their governance and the legitimacy of their occupation, etc.? Maybe you could speak a little bit about that.
Well, I think that you're correct to say that Edward Said is someone who is, at the end of the day, very critical of Orientalism for its racism, for its authoritarianism, although Edward Said is not a critic of liberalism. Edward Said basically, he's not a critic of liberalism or liberal modernity or the Enlightenment. I mean, that's a difference that you get with Edward Said versus Talal Asad or Wael Halak. So, here are other people that you have in the New York area or even affiliated with Columbia or even Joseph Massad. I mean, one of the things that you get when you're talking about this more recent generation of scholars is the way that they move beyond Edward Said is they say that the problems that Edward Said was criticizing. So Edward Said attributed lots of issues with Orientalism just to Orientalists, like, oh, these Orientalists are racists or these Orientalists are ethnocentric. Whereas if you look at people like Talal Asad or Wael Halak or Joseph Massad, they're willing to say, in fact, none of this, or this is not primarily, the issue here is not Orientalism. The issue here is liberal modernity, the epistemology of liberal modernity. And in fact, to the extent that there are shortcomings in the Orientalist analysis of Muslims, these don't emerge within Orientalism. They are basically emerged within liberal modernity and then are applied by Orientalists in their study of the Muslim world. So Orientalism is basically a liberal worldview, a liberal means of analysis as applied to the Muslim world. Now, when liberals apply this set of analysis to the Muslim world, one of the things that they want to do that I think Edward Said was quite correct to point out is they basically flagged elements of the Islamic tradition which conflict with liberalism. So part of that is because they wanted to reform these things. They saw certain practices as outrageous, as wrong. So if you look at many pre-modern Muslim texts, the way that Muslims understand their religion is, what is Islam about? Okay, it's about prayer. And that's associated with virtues like Iman, like, belief in God, love of God, remembrance of God, fear of God. Okay, it's about fasting and self-control. Oh, it's about zakat, giving charity to the poor. That's not very sexy. That's not very interesting. If we look at courses that Westerners since the Orientalist period teach on Islam, that's not what they want to talk about. They want to talk about hand chopping. They want to talk about jihad. And they also want to understand jihad in specific terms which are most offensive to Western sensibilities. So basically what they do is they cobble together every single element of the Islamic tradition. But I'm not trying to deny that there's not material on the hudud in pre-modern Muslim legal compendia. Of course there are, but this is dwarfed by the material that's, let's say, on ablution, wudu, like washing with water. But Westerners don't focus on how Muslims in the pre-modern period conceptualize their religion, what they give emphasis to. Because if they were to look at what pre-modern Muslims focus on in their religion, it's about Tawheed, it's about remembrance of that the one will be judged for one's good and bad deeds, that there's going to be this day of judgment, that you should cultivate certain virtues like love and thankfulness and fear of God. That primarily in terms of your daily life, it's about performing rituals of thankfulness to God and being a good spouse and being a good family member and giving to the poor. This is not what they want to talk about. It's all hudud, jihad, slavery, abuse of women, abuse of non-Muslim minorities. This is what is cobbled together. And the only unifying factor here is basically what conflicts with liberal sensibilities. And what they want to do is they want to put together a list of all the things which conflict with liberal sensibilities, take them out of context, and then publicize this as a way of justifying interventions in the Muslim world, and also pinpointing interventions that need to be made. Like, oh, you have a particular Islamic doctrines which say X, Y, and Z about corporal punishment, or about the rights of men and women in marriage. Those need to be changed because they fail to meet a liberal standard. So for instance, maybe in liberalism, what we are primarily concerned with is, we're not particularly concerned with preserving marriages and extended families. We want to give people more individual liberty in terms of their sexual affairs. So let's kind of tag all of the Muslim rules that conflict with this, say that they're human rights violations, use this to justify colonial rule. If people want to maintain these norms as a way of maintaining their families, maybe we'll call them fanatics or radicals or extremists, and we'll target them with particular measures. So kind of that is, I would agree with Said and some other figures that what Orientalist and colonial or post-colonial global war on terrorism scholarship has been concerned with is by kind of collecting together everything which offends liberal sensibilities, publicizing that material and using it as a way of encouraging policymakers to take action, to intervene in the Muslim world in order to structure a Muslim society such that they resemble liberal Western societies, or so they reach higher levels of what would be called the human rights and development.
Oh, yeah. So one of the things that I noticed is that I think there was a scholar who wrote on liberalism in India, who called the period around 1830 what he called the liberal constitutional moment. So it was a moment in like the 1820s, 1830s, where in India, for instance, we see that anti-colonial actors moved from claims of sovereignty, whereby they explicitly saw colonial intervention as being something against their natural right to self-determination, towards what he calls a liberal constitutional moment, which means that they started to appeal towards liberal norms as a way of trying to carve out a space for themselves. And this policy of using liberal values as a way of resisting liberal interventionism seems to be a bit self-defeatist, given the fact of how you've explained it, that basically this is simply a kind of a liberal first policy of this is kind of what they want you to do, right? They kind of want you to start to appeal towards liberal norms, and then it kind of puts liberalism in the driving seat as the one who drives the conversation. It seems like this shift that happened in like the 1830s. I mean, you Sorry
Hello?
about that. Yeah,
No, no
sorry
problem.
about
It
that.
just looks like the screen froze for a second. So you were talking about this change that you get in the 1830s and how this notion of justifying one's right to particular political rights by appeal to liberal values is self-defeating. That's when it kind of cut off.
Yeah. I mean, and it seems like, we're still in that mode, right? Like, I mean, people are, if you look at movements in the Muslim world, it seems like Islamist, modernist, whatever, are still bound by liberal norms and practices in trying to carve out spaces for themselves. And this, taking your position more seriously seems to be kind of like a self-defeating strategy, because liberal modernity is the problem.
Yeah, so I mean, the issue with liberal modernity is also that the standards are going to constantly change. So, for instance, no matter what any group does, it's never going to be enough. Like, there's no end point. So, of course, when you talk about the 19th century, it's not that liberals went to maximum individualism, maximum equality all at once. They were willing initially to accept some social or political limitations to preserve religious traditions or marital structures or family structures or communal forms of identity. But gradually they eroded them over the past 2 centuries to move towards a society of people who are more and more individual in character, even if that means the collapse of religious traditions in the form of secularization, the collapse of marriages, the collapse of extended families, the collapse of communities and cultural traditions generally, forms of nationalism. So these are all being eroded as a step-by-step process. So first of all, Muslims basically, like other colonized peoples, began by just basically imitating liberals where they were in 1800, but then they would constantly move, because something like children's rights, freedom of religion, women's rights, all of these different or criminal rights of people who are accused of crimes, they keep shifting over time. There's no end. So for instance, maybe one day it's no corporal punishment. And then next day, for instance, it's no death penalty for juveniles. Next step, no death penalty for human beings generally. Then you could also, with technology, you can also move to new options as well. So maybe in the future, you'd say any type of punishment for criminals is wrong, because maybe if someone commits a crime, you should just kind of put in a microchip or treat them pharmaceutically. So there's kind of no necessary end to this. Or when it comes to something like individual children's rights, maybe initially you say children's rights mean that they shouldn't get married or they should go to school. And they shouldn't work before a particular age. But maybe then you will say, well, maybe no one should ever maybe the age of marriage should be 15, and maybe it should be 20. Then maybe people should never get married because marriage is something that leads to all forms of commitment, and it limits your sexual freedom, and it's tied to forms of inequality. And maybe in the future, as you get robots, maybe as people get access to robots as companions, or AI or kind of virtual reality as a means of meeting their romantic or their desires for company. Maybe marriage as a whole should be abolished. So with new technologies, there's also no end to this liberalization process. This liberalization process has a transhuman character. And that's why many liberals today identify as transhumanists. So for instance, in order to achieve maximum equality, maximum freedom, ultimately we need to move beyond the human species.
How is this different from just regular work of the fuqaha in dealing with new cases? I mean, what you're saying, why doesn't this just fall in line with, hey, look, times are changing. We gotta just, these are new cases that need to be dealt with on a moral, legal perspective for Muslims, and this is just life. Life is, change. So how is what you're describing is actually, it's not just the modernist approach to life that look, we have to deal with the times, but there's something exceptionally different here that liberalism is doing.
Well, I would say human beings. So this gets into some of my research, which overlaps with my research on colonialism, but is also somewhat distinct, which is research on the biologically rooted psychology of human beings and how this pertains to the colonial project. So human beings have there are many studies which indicate that like experiments, which indicate that human moral psychology is very complicated. So basically, humans don't have one form of morality. They have a number of different forms of morality, which can be in tension with one another. So one is like a utilitarian form of morality that you find in pre-modern Islamic law under maslaha or maqasid al-sharia, or in specific methodologies like istislah or istihsan, which is basically what makes an act or a law good is maximizing happiness. And you can always change the law for the sake of maximizing happiness or minimizing suffering. That's one element of all human moral systems, including the Sharia. But human beings also have other elements of morality. So they have a deontological element of morality, which is some things are wrong regardless of how happy it makes you. So it might make you happy to engage in incest with your sibling. Maybe it's consensual, maybe you have birth control, so there's no danger of a child who has birth defects. But the idea is that's wrong in and of itself, even if it makes people happier. Or maybe lying is wrong in and of itself, even though telling certain lies can make people happier. Or there's also this notion that there are particular, or another deontological rule is if someone kills or harms another person, they should be killed. They should be exposed to the same punishment, even though you could have a society where people are happier if you have a murderer or a rapist and all that happens to them is they're given like a pill such that they don't murder or rape again. The idea would that would be problematic, that there's a principle of justice that when someone does something wrong, that they're subject to a type of qisas, they're subject to a type of a punishment, regardless of what kind of social or technological changes there are. So there's that deontological component to morality, that there are certain things that are right or wrong, regardless of changes in society or technology. And then the third component to morality is people believe, every group of human beings naturally believes that they have an obligation to preserve themselves as a people and to preserve their distinctive way of life. And they recognize that this is something that you find from children. It's something that is that's found in every single society. People don't want to see their people, their nation, their tradition destroyed. They don't like cultural genocides. They don't like biological genocides. Chinese, Jews, Muslims don't want to live in a world where they've been dissolved out of existence. And a people only exists insofar as its defining features, as its shared traditions exist. So when there is no longer a set of shared beliefs and rituals and distinctive norms which separate the Muslim Ummah, that Muslim Ummah is gone. Now, so that's another reason if someone were to say, well, all of the distinctive beliefs and rituals and norms which define the Muslim community don't produce enough maslaha these days, they don't really fit the economic and technological changes that have occurred, okay, let's get rid of them. Basically, that's agreeing to a cultural genocide of the Muslim people. In the pre-modern period, Muslims, like other groups, affirm this complex morality. It's not to say that they didn't give maslaha some role. No, they did. But they also believed that certain elements of the Sharia, certain moral norms shouldn't change in keeping with kind of a deontological principle. They also believed that they should go ahead and preserve the Ummah, preserve the Muslim community and its distinctive feature, such that they didn't imitate other communities to assimilate them in terms of their rituals, in terms of their norms, because they wanted the Muslim community to persist into the future. So one reason,
how is this? how is this different from like what liberalism is pushing us, this transhuman future
Liberalism
that
is
how does liberalism not give us the same opportunity to have a deontological, utilitarian, and what you might call cultural, social norms?
Well, so liberalism is tied to particular psychological changes. Liberalism is very much about promoting human happiness, and especially by promoting human happiness by giving people more and more freedom, but through new technologies and also through restructuring social norms. And liberals are completely okay. Okay, if it makes you happy to have sex with your sibling and doesn't cause anyone else harm, so be it. If it makes you happy, not to for instance, take care of your mother in her old age, no problem. As long as the state takes care of her with Social Security and makes her happy. Look, as long as we prevent crime by, let's say, incarceration or pharmaceutical treatment, there's no need to impose a principle of justice on deontological grounds. So liberalism is very much okay with throwing out traditional deontological morality. Moreover, since liberalism is about individual happiness, maximizing individual happiness, it's not concerned with preserving communities. And in fact, the preservation of a community often comes at the expense of individual happiness. So in order to preserve a community, you need to have children, for instance. But children come with all kinds of duties. You have to work, you have to make money to feed your children. You have all kinds of obligations to your children that can limit your individual happiness. But in these pre-modern traditions, including Islam, they say everyone has an obligation to get married. Everyone has an obligation to have children. Everyone has an obligation to uphold communal Muslim norms. And if someone were to say, well, what about my individual happiness? In the pre-modern period, Muslims would say, look, we value individual happiness to a degree, but we also value preserving the Muslim community as well. And it needs to be a balance. Our social policy is not just what makes you happy. To an extent, we're concerned with making you happy, maslahah and so forth and so on, but we also want to preserve the Muslim ummah. That's also a goal. That's also something which is morally important to us. We don't want preservation of the deen as one of the maqasid means preserving the deen, which are the shared norms and the shared beliefs and the shared rituals of the Muslim community, not only for this life, but also for the next life.
I want to move to different. I mean, this discussion has so many facets. So forgive me for kind of jumping around a little
No
bit.
problem. I hope what I'm saying is somewhat coherent. You're asking me very deep questions that involve very complex issues, and I address them in a more systematic way in my article. So if you want to read some of these articles that I posted online, please do it. Then you'll get kind of a more coherent answer that is also more detailed and where actually will cite evidence from my statements.
No,
this kind
sure,
of discussion,
sure.
I'm limited in how much evidence I can cite.
No problem. So, one of the things that I found really interesting, right, is that there's a tension between, let's say Western liberal policies towards authoritarian regimes in the Muslim world, and then the propaganda around their direct intervention. So direct intervention in the Muslim world in both Iraq and Afghanistan recently was premised on a promise of delivering a liberal society, a truly liberal society, right? And then, but at the same time, it embodied all of the states of emergency measures when that occupation was in place, right? But then, it seems as though, let's take the case of Afghanistan, right? Afghanistan is an example of a really concerted effort for 20 years to try to create a liberal government in Afghanistan, which failed to manifest itself. And then the Americans left, and they keep pointing to Afghanistan and saying, see, it's not a liberal society. And there's this tension also in Iraq is the same thing, right? So in Iraq, there was an intervention, right, based upon liberating the people of Iraq from an authoritarian dictator. And then there was a long multi-year intervention, failed, left, and then like, look, it's sad, Iraq is not a liberal democracy. And for a lot of people in the Muslim world, this left a weird sense of feelings, right? So one hand, yeah, are we really just this like sectarian society that Iraq is pushing forward? Is that what we are? We really need American intervention to survive? Or, or like in Afghanistan's case, like, the Taliban are now there, and is this what we are? Is this who we are? So there's a lot of confusion around this. How would you help us to think about, in terms of your familiarity with Islam and colonialism, how are we supposed to interpret these more familiar recent events, which are?
Well, I would say that, much of the war on terror discourse surrounding the Iraq and Afghanistan intervention, it's almost laughable. It's based on kind of fantasies about liberal ideas. People pretend that the only countries that exist in the world are, let's say, Muslim countries and the West. And, the question is, are Muslim countries ready to adopt liberal values or not? If they are, then Iraq and Afghanistan are going to become Sweden and Germany in 20 years. In reality, liberal ideas have been tried and are being applied in Latin America, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Southeast Asia. They haven't generated Western type societies. Western type societies, arguably their most important feature, and one which is extremely important for structuring society in such a way that people don't need the unifying to depend on religious institutions or family institutions and so forth, is a certain level of economic growth and stability and power that comes from that level of economic growth. Liberalism has failed in almost every country that it's been practiced. It's only succeeded in Western countries and countries which have a Western heritage, which means Western Europe, North America, and Australia. It's failed in Eastern Europe. It's failed in South America. It's failed in sub-Saharan Africa. It's failed in Southeast Asia. Why would we assume that the Middle Eastern or South Asian countries like Afghanistan and Iraq, why when they practice liberalism, are they going to have a faith that is so different from Latin America or South Asia or Southeast Asia or sub-Saharan Africa? One would expect that they would have the majority of, that they would have a destiny which is very similar. In fact, what I see is the Muslim countries.
I have to jump in here, because in one way, this kind of argument about the non-applicability of liberalism has led to some people, especially amongst Muslims thinkers, to say, listen, this is why we need kingships. This is why we need dictators. This is why we need to have these kinds of authoritarian regimes. This is because we aren't. We're just not a democratic society. We're not. This is not our. We don't have this cultural background. And people who argue for this are people who are trying to take us away from who we are. So, but also that doesn't seem to be satisfactory as well. I can understand the argument, right? Like that there's this historical and economic context for liberalism, right? It's not just transplantable everywhere. But then again, how do we deal with the fact that people then use this argument to justify, CC or
okay, so
NBS or MBZ, or what I mean, like all this.
So there are a number of points, regardless of if one thinks that they have a magical recipe to attain a certain level of GDP or economic growth. People want to come up with these fantasies like, oh, it's due to the Islamic tradition that we don't have this level of, that we don't have a GDP that's equal to Germany, or it's due to our system of governance. In reality, it doesn't matter Islam is in that society or Islam is not in that society. It doesn't matter what type of government you have. There are other structural features of the world economy and of these different other cultural and historical factors which structurally make it very unlikely that any of these, it makes it, if Muslims want to know what their challenges are, they should look at other developing countries. So Muslim countries, I would say they face the same kind of challenges as other developing countries in the global south, with one exception, which is that they are more socially conservative, and for that reason, Westerners have felt more comfortable destabilizing and invading them. So they have all of the challenges of developing countries, plus in addition to that, these invasions and constant acts of destabilization. So there are those factors. On top of that, in terms of what is the best way to attain GDP, GDP growth, why would one assume that it's the Western model as opposed to, let's say, the Chinese or the Singapore model? I mean, many of the countries which have attained certain levels of economic growth, what is not important is accepting liberal values. What's important is, certain countries in the global north, whether it is the global north, the western portion of the global north, or the eastern portion of the global north, these countries have attained economic development, and it doesn't appear that the acceptance of liberal values has been the major factor. If it was, you could simply export those Western values to the developing world, and they would attain the same level of economic growth. So I don't even think that, until someone explains to me how that's supposed to happen, and they give me some examples. So I would say this to anyone who says, let's just bring liberal values to the Muslim world. Let's just liberalize our Muslim societies. I would say, give me a single example of a country in Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, which has actually done that and which has achieved what you've claimed will happen. And they won't find one. So for that reason, even that as a goal, it seems to me to be an unrealistic goal. Now, what about, does this justify authoritarian rule? It also depends on what you call authoritarian rule. So right now, Muslim countries face unending authoritarian rule justified as a temporary measure in order to bring some type of GDP growth that's not going to come, and some type of social changes that are never going to come. One could imagine other forms of rule, which are, for instance, one could imagine other forms of rule that are just as likely to generate GDP growth, but which respect the norms of the people, which respect their traditions, which respect their way of life, which respect their values. It could be a democracy. It could be
some people will argue that Japan, South Korea, and Singapore, for instance, are examples of societies that have modernized and therefore have become highly developed counterexamples to.
Okay, so Singapore is Singapore has an authoritarian government. On top of that, all of these countries are Northeast Asian. Why is it that all of these? So when one is choosing these examples, one is talking about Northeast Asian populations. I accept Northeast Asian populations can modernize for whatever reason, but they didn't need liberalism to do this. So for instance, fascist Japan was a very modern place. It was a very technologically powerful, modern government. South Korea, much of its modernization was done under an authoritarian regime. China is growing enormously powerful through an authoritarian regime. So it doesn't appear that authoritarianism in and of itself is the issue when it comes to being a more powerful country. I'm not saying that means I'm pro-authoritarianism or anti-authoritarianism. I'll also have to say, what do we mean by authoritarianism? Because a lot of the time, people mean authoritarianism simply to mean non-application of liberal law, and that could mean a variety of things. So one reason why people might not apply liberal law is in order to force the people to accept liberal values. Another reason why people might not apply liberal law is in order to preserve their traditions and their family structures and their marriages. In some cases, you might not apply liberal norms, and it might be endorsed by the population as a whole. In other cases, you might, for instance, you might use authoritarian rule to basically push the entire population to do so. Even then, we have to talk about what system.
Dr. Arya, I know that I'm sorry, forgive me, really. I mean, I don't want to keep interrupting you, but we have a few more minutes left, and I want to touch on some other issues, especially about your work about reform, right? So I know that you worked on reform in Islamic law, right, as a response to colonialism and modernization, and thinking about what Muslims should do about their traditional values and trying to preserve them. There's been many different reform projects that have emerged, right, since like basically the 19th century. What is your understanding of the politics of reform in Islamic law and Islamic practice in terms of colonial interests and current colonial practice?
So my understanding of reform is it's just accepting evolving discourses of human rights and development in the name of utilitarian reasoning. So maslaha or maqasid al-sharia. Basically, if you want to know the future of reform in the Muslim world, I wouldn't even go talk to Muslim scholars. I would say go to a Western country, see what developments there are in human rights. So I'll give you an example. You want my prediction about Islamic reform in the future? Okay, right now in Western countries, they're decriminalizing things like various types of drugs, like marijuana and even hard drugs. They're also decriminalizing sex work. That's going to be the new Islamic reform. They're just going to need to get to it. Then, 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line, everyone is going to discover based on a new tafsir or on the basis of maqasid al-sharia that in fact, all of this is allowed by Islam.
Can you please speak about maqasid al-sharia's instrumental role in pushing forward liberal norms? Because there has been an element of Muslim political activists, particularly, who have emphasized the potentialities of maqasid al-sharia and achieving what you might call good governance. But it seems to me that maqasid al-sharia is a kind of double-edged sword. Like you're saying that both it was part of the tradition, but then it also can be a kind of catch-all to like accelerate forward Muslims into this liberal, transhuman, cyborg future.
Yeah, so maqasid al-sharia has a particular place in pre-modern jurisprudence. From the standpoint of pre-modern Islamic jurisprudence, maqasid al-sharia is extremely important. It's extremely important to understanding the wisdom of Islamic law. It's necessary for the flexibility of Islamic law. It's completely orthodox. It's completely legitimate. It's completely endorsed in Islamic texts and should be respected as such. But in the pre-modern period, the type of utilitarian reasoning associated with maqasid al-sharia was counterbalanced by deontological reasoning and also a desire to preserve the Islamic tradition. So it was one strand of morality that was counterbalanced by other strands. There are many things. So for instance, imagine someone says, what's your view of qisas in Islamic law? And the person says, well, I know that qisas in Islamic law, it's like if someone knocks out your tooth, you should knock out their tooth. Okay, that type of retaliation makes sense because it's just. So someone knocks out your tooth, you knock out their tooth as a retaliation. But if they were to say, no, retaliation without any limits, like they knocked out your tooth, kill them, then you would say that's not really a representation of the Islamic tradition. The Islamic tradition is about balance, it's about limits. Utilitarian reasoning has always been acknowledged as a beautiful, necessary part of the Islamic tradition. But if you turn it into some kind of thing where it's not balanced by deontological considerations or the considerations of preserving the Islamic Ummah, it becomes a tool of destroying the entire Islamic tradition. It's the same thing as aql. The Quran praises aql and tadabbur and tafakkur. Aql has always been a part of the Islamic tradition. But if you want to say, oh, maximum aql like the falasifa and no respect for naql, no respect for the nusus, then this aspect of the Islamic tradition, which is naql, which was always viewed as a beautiful thing, becomes a tool to demolish the entire Islamic tradition. So that would be my analysis of reformist efforts that embrace maqasid al-Sharia. So my issue is not, oh, they embrace maqasid al-Sharia. I would say, okay, well, how do you incorporate the deontological aspects of Islamic law? How do you incorporate the respect for the unique and distinctive beliefs and rituals and norms which define the Muslims as a people? What efforts are you putting into? What measures are you undertaking to preserve those things? Because honestly, when you look at these reformists, I don't see many of them having much of a plan to preserve those things. Ultimately, it becomes a system of just constant concessions, of getting rid of every single Islamic moral, Sharia-based, or theological belief one by one to accommodate liberal notions of development and human rights. And if that's
do you have an example of maybe how this could happen? I mean, like, could you give me an example of something that maybe reformists have used? I know things have come to my mind. I mean, you know, certain political reforms come to my mind. But is there something in particular? I mean, I know that one of the things that makes your scholarship so strong is that, you know, you also have a JD. I mean, you're also a lawyer, and so you deal in the nitty gritty of these kind of legal questions as well in your scholarship.
Yeah, so first it becomes abolition of the hudud, then it becomes abolition of Islamic commercial laws you might find in the Majalla.
Yes.
Then you find abolition of family law, like technically Islamic family law is still there, except in reality, they start changing around the various rules. So, you know, in reality, there's reduction of the role of the wali. There are restrictions placed on marriage age. There are restrictions. The property is also divided in new different ways through various means. Like, for instance, when two people sign a marriage contract, the government will say, oh, you have to register the marriage contract. And as part of registering the marriage contract, both parties hold the same amount of property. None of this is consistent. This is gradually eroding Islamic marriage law. The same thing is true when it comes to Islamic beliefs. So people will go ahead and they will increasingly allow people, you know, not only to leave aside all of the traditional theological schools, but people will go ahead and interpret more and more of the Quran as metaphorical. Oh, the story of Adam and Eve is really a metaphor for evolution. Oh, jinn are really microbes, or jinn are really just the notion of evil. Moreover, on top of that, in reality, it doesn't matter whether you're Muslim or non-Muslim, everyone is going to be saved at the end of the day by God. So that's, you know, okay as a measure of kind of interfaith relations. So it's this kind of step-by-step erosion.
That makes it very clear. Thank you. My last question, because we ran out of time, and I really wish I could sit and talk to you longer.
You're always free to call me. You can always give me a call. You can always email me.
That's great.
It's fun for me to talk about these issues.
Finally, one of the reasons we study the colonial experience is for the aspiration of political sovereignty. I mean, to try to as a Muslim community and as Muslim societies, to try to get to a state where we are in control of our tradition, our people, our future, our society. So, we're now in a phase. We're now in a phase in the Muslim world after the Arab Spring, where neither the promise of Islamist resistance nor modernist liberal democratic reform, nor authoritarian dictatorial traditional regimes, none of these seem to give us any viable option to the future. So in studying colonialism and Islam, what is the takeaway? I mean, how are we as scholars of Islamic, Islamic international relations, political theory, politics, what are we supposed to take away from this? What can we do now, what is your contribution to this kind of broader question? I mean, one of the good things about a place like CIGA is that, we don't have to sit and talk about very specific, academic concerns. We can also speak generally about, our societies. This is one of the advantages. And so I would want to put that in front of you. One second, my thing just ran out of. I have to get my.
Yeah, no problem. Take your time.
Plugged in. 1 second. Because my Bluetooth just ran out of. Okay, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So can you just, as a final concluding remark, in this context, how can our study of the colonial experience and Islamic thought and Islamic life, what can we do now as Muslims?
I would say that, first of all, you can be in a situation where you have a very limited amount of power, like the early Muslim community in Medina, or when the Muslims were facing the Mongols. I think two things that Muslims can always do are the following. First of all, you don't know what's going to happen to you, but you can stick to your principles. That's always one possibility. At the very least, the one thing that you'll be granted in life is the ability to live a principled life. And then whatever happens, happens. Second thing I would say, though, as a kind of a more socially impactful solution, would be honest. Go ahead and be honest about what is happening. So for instance, if someone says something like, whether it is, if Muslim countries weren't just Muslim anymore, they would all automatically morph into Germany and Sweden. Present them data and evidence which shows that this is ridiculous. So much hate directed towards Muslim societies from outside of Muslim societies or inside of Muslim societies is based on fantasies about where GDP growth comes from. I'm not saying that religion doesn't impact this to a lesser extent, but it's by no means the most important factor. So number one, be realistic. Whether these countries are Muslim or everyone becomes an atheist tomorrow, that is not going to remove the structural, political, economic inequalities that exist in that world. So let's be honest about that. Number two, let's be honest about where most of the modernist projects, reformist projects are leading us. Let's be honest about the fact that these don't represent, for the most part, there are always exceptions, but for the most part, all of these projects which have been put forth, these reformist projects, are basically conceding one element of the Islamic tradition after another as part of secularization, a secularization project, whether that's admitted or not. And the path that they lead towards is the path of secularization, which has resulted in the destruction of almost all world religious traditions to this day. That is what this track leads to. So be honest about that. Be honest about the fact that this project will not allow you to hold on to a single moral teaching or a single theological teaching. Don't kid yourself about where the dominant projects are leading. That doesn't necessarily mean there's an easy solution, but it tells you something about the track that is out there right now, that this track is not driven about this set of circumstances which underlies the dominant Islamic reform projects. These are driven by political forces, an overall modernization development project, which is centered in non-Muslim lands and is not particularly concerned with preserving the Islamic tradition. In fact, quite the opposite. Another thing is, one needs to recognize that this project is not just going to end with the collapse of the Islamic tradition. The Islamic tradition collapses. The worst that happens is that the Muslim world just becomes like a world where there is where everyone has, nice marriages, nice families, a nice community, but there's no longer an Islamic tradition. No, this is a transhuman project. Forget about marriage. Forget about family. for a bit about living in a government that's not controlled by kind of like a technological totalitarianism. Also forget about even controlling your own body or your own mind or your children. These are going to be recreated, technologically restructured. You yourself are going to be obliged to improve your body in a variety of ways. I'm not going to speak on, too many more comments about that, but these type of projects are already afoot. So if one believes that just the worst case scenario is I just preserve Islam in my heart, but other than that, everything is, not everything is, I'm not going to face any of these other challenges. That's not true. It's not true for Muslims. It's not true for non-Muslims. This really isn't so much just a Muslim problem. This is a humanity problem. Now the way that this world is structured is structured to use authoritarian, violent methods to drive humans in a transhuman direction, to dissolve all of their religious and cultural traditions, to dissolve the human race itself, to dissolve all of their most cherished relations, marital, family relations. And anyone who opposes this project, even if they're not part of any group, they're not part of any political group, let alone a moral group, maybe they just do something like make a post on Twitter, like, I don't like where this is going. All of a sudden, even this itself is seen as too problematic, that one needs to be marginalized or hunted down for even saying these kind of things. So that's what the stakes are. The stakes are quite high, I would argue.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nakisa, for your participation and your enlightening comments about the topic that you're researching currently, and generally about the situation that Muslim societies find themselves in. I really appreciate you coming. I know that you're a busy person, and despite that, you took time out to spend with us. Hopefully, we'll be able to see you in Istanbul at some point.
Oh, I love Istanbul.
We'd love to host you. We'd love to see you at the center and continue these conversations. So once again, thank you for that. I want to tell all the viewers that to keep your calendars open for next month. The topic and the speakers to be announced, but like every month we will have another webinar on the questions concerning Islam and global affairs. Thank you very much for spending your evening with us here at IZU.
Okay.
Thank you very much.